The Romanoff Foundation is proud to present an evening featuring the cultural heritage from the Romanov dynasty. The evening is called Romanoff Variations, and it was arranged by Mariana Hazeltine. So we'll be listening to music and culture from the time of the Romanovs, which we'll be celebrating today. We hope you enjoy this event as much as we do, and we'd love to have you join us and help the Romanoff Foundation as we look to sponsor the cultural and heritage of Russia's past.
Tonight, we will be celebrating the artistic legacy of the Romanovs, from their beginnings in 1613 to the end in 1919, which has been marked with a number of celebrations and centenary commemorations in this year. Tonight, we will take you on a sweeping cultural history of Russia's greatest musicians and composers, and of course their royal patrons, because Russia owes establishment of the classical school to the Romanovs.
We're talking about a country, the story of a country coming from almost nowhere, musically, culturally, artistically, and reaching and in some ways surpassing its Western counterparts in the space of merely 200 years.
This evening's idea came out of a meeting I had with Mikhail Borisovich Piotrovsky, director of the Hermitage Museum, at a debate that we organized with the art newspaper Russia at the Hermitage Theater a few years ago.
Culture can't help anything. Culture is the most important thing. Whatever happens in politics and economics is just nonsense compared to culture. Culture is everything, and our job is to protect culture. If there isn't culture, nothing can be helped. Culture is a bridge, and it is the bridge which we must burn last.
Well, that's so serious. Can we entertain our guests a little bit?
Sure. Well, when I want some light relief, I think about the rules which Catherine II, Catherine the Great of Russia, imposed on her people when she wanted to bring them up to date with the West. She wrote these rules, which you can find at your leisure on they're stuck to the walls around. You can have a look at them at your leisure. There's about 10 rules. Amongst them are, be merry, but neither spoil nor break anything, nor indeed gnaw at anything. Gnaw, для русских, это грызть. Do not gnaw on anything. Drink in moderation. It's a very Russian invocation. So that each should be able always to find his legs on leaving these doors. Now, the punishments for these infractions were not exactly severe. One of them was to make you drink a glass of cold water. The other one was to recite some lyrics, or the other was to get you to learn lyrics on the spot. And one of the rules was that one mustn't wear a hat. You should leave your sword and your hat at the door. We have a gentleman here who I'm sorry sir, what's your name?
Alex.
I'm sorry, you can't wear a hat.
Sorry about that.
So but you've broken the rule now.
Oh, okay.
So I'm afraid we're going to have to punish you. Do you speak Russian?
No.
You don't? Okay, it doesn't matter. So, after me, please. Буря мглою небо кроет, вихри снежные крутя, то, как зверь она завоет, то заплачет, как дитя.
Sorry, I can't help you there.
Okay, it'll just have to be a glass of cold water then. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alex.
So, the Romanovs, Tsars, lived at this magnificent residence. Obviously, we have the later variation of the Winter Palace, but that's the one we are able to see now who travels to St. Petersburg. They entertained, the guests here held their balls, and of course the music was very present in this building. We are going to listen to the first, except of music, Batticini Granduo Concertante.
1917, revolution in Russia, the first Christmas without a sitting monarch. And while Nicholas and his family are in Tobolsk, not aware of their fate, little did they know they would then go to Yekaterinburg, where they would meet their end. At that very time, Russia's greatest living composer, Sergei Rachmaninoff, gets into an open sledge because the train broke down. He was trying to get out of Russia. He lost all his lands, everything had been taken from him. He gets into an open sledge with his daughters and crosses the border into Finland, never to see his lands again, to become permanent exile. The next piece, Prelude in G-sharp minor by Rachmaninoff, is a musical evocation of the great and terrible and vast landscape of Russia. And somewhere in there, you should hear the sleigh bells. Rachmaninoff in exile in America is one of the great tragedies of this story, and we will come back to it at the end. We're hoping to cover the chronology of this great Russian leap into culture. But Rachmaninoff lost so many of his great friends who were murdered in the revolution. When he finally got to America, he never again produced anything like the work. He simply couldn't work. He felt himself to be a ghost. But looking back, he mourned his country, the loss of his country. We'd like to play you, before we begin our chronology, we'd like to play you one more piece by him, one of his most beloved early compositions, in which you might get a sense of the foreboding. It's called Elegy. Our story begins 1613. Russia has had the so-called Smutное время, the time of troubles, when Russia was really plunged into complete social darkness in a way, one of the darkest times in Russia's history, at the end of which they decided enough of this. We need to appoint a Tsar. And almost randomly, a man called Mikhail Romanov, the first of this entire generation of Romanovs, was chosen to become the new Tsar. He was a 16-year-old boy living, at the time, he was with his mother at a place called the Ipatiev Monastery, which many of you will know is ironic because Ipatiev is a name which chimes with the end of the Romanovs as well, so with the beginning and the end, bookmarking this time. And so he is brought in, some sort of order is restored, but, and at the time, musically, where is Russia? Russia, virtually the only musical instrument is the human voice at this time, to give you some idea. There's no musical instrumentation, there are no composers. But it's really with Peter I, Peter the Great, that we have to start, because he is Michael's grandson, a very tall man, brave, went around Europe learning, physically working, studying the craft of what was going on in Europe. He was determined to turn Russia into a modern country and transform a new capital out of this bog that was previously, that became St. Petersburg. And he was insisted on hiring the very best. And with Peter, bans were lifted on opera, ballet, chamber music, Baroque music, architecture, even novels, even portraiture suddenly now was allowed under Peter and began to thrive, although obviously it was going to be a very long process. And Peter, together with his daughter Elizabeth, would bring in the very best shining lights of European architecture, mostly from Italy, and to build St. Petersburg and make it the city that it is now. But what about the music? Well, there would be no native composers from Russia for quite a while yet, some 80 more years. But in 1736, if you can imagine the draw that Russia was starting to have, that this incredible capital with its brilliance, its lights, and its social scene, and the money which they could offer, the money was no object. They enticed an Italian opera company to leave the warmth of Italy and take up permanent residence in cold, chilly St. Petersburg. It's another 30 years until Catherine the Great, when we will start to see actual native composers and a native music scene, if you like. Catherine actively promotes these advances. She sends Russian composers abroad to train so that they can come back and bring their skills back to Russia. She builds a theatre adjacent to the Winter Palace, which earned the nickname the Hermitage. And this Hermitage name that later became attached to the museum that is there now. And the arts become her number one passion, music and the evening, the social scene. And actually, rather like today, she sends her buyers into Europe to purchase works of art and entire collections. And just like now, Russian buyers were the most dreaded art buyers on the scene in Western Europe. But the real coming of age will happen with the next two Romanovs, Alexander I and Nicholas I. Alexander, 1801, Nicholas, 1825, came to power. It was a remarkable time for Russia, of course. Russia defeated Napoleon, who thought that he could take on Russia. They burnt Moscow. Napoleon was left with nothing. He had to go back. Alexander was victorious, but it was actually Nicholas who musically composed the first, or commissioned the first real piece of music that would be a national meeting point, psychologically, musically, for the country to get behind. And he commissioned a work by Glinka, which Nicholas wanted something which reflected well on him and on his position as well. And so the story chosen was that of Ivan Susanin, who by sacrificing himself to the enemy saved the life of Mikhail Romanov, the first Romanov, and thereby saved the Tsar, the dynasty, and the nation. Glinka composed the music. Nicholas chose the librettist.
When I play his music, I really feel the pain and all the emotions he was feeling at the time. I think his music is really good at transporting you back to his time I really feel like this piece is up to the audience to interpret and really find their own story and connect with the piece.
You may know, or the thing that was significant about Glinka was that he incorporated folk elements. That was what made his art, his music, particularly Russian and particularly popular with Nicholas. Glinka was most important to his countrymen as the first to claim a prize for Russia in the international musical world. And he would influence the next major player on the scene, which was Franz Liszt. So Liszt comes to Russia, falls in love with Glinka's music, falls in love with Russia and the Russian music scene in general, but it would become a reciprocal relationship, one which would affect Russian music all the way down the line, really. And of course, pianos. Suddenly, partly thanks to Liszt, pianos, piano recitals, buying pianos and getting your children to play the piano suddenly became very, very important. Extracts from Beethoven's Sonata No. 7 and Chopin's Waltz in B minor. forgot to mention that Russia became one of the global centers of piano production. Thanks to Alexander. And actually, the Russians call a grand piano, which was more or less invented around this time, a royal, in honor of its royal heritage, if you like. So now St. Petersburg becomes the Mecca, the place for, the designation for all Europe's leading musicians and maestros. Poor old Richard Wagner, who wanted to come, asked, but was declined. But others, such as Schumann, Verdi, and Saint-Saëns, did get their chance to shine in Russia. And this next piece is an introduction and Rondo Capriccioso by Camille Saint-Saëns, and it will be performed by Claire Wells on violin and Svetlana Kosinka on piano. Chenyo Ma on violin, Yelena Horvat on violin, Leon Sturdy on viola, and Eddie Mead on cello. Nocturne from String Quartet No. 2 in D by Alexander Borodin. Russia, thanks to the conservatoire, there's one in, first of all, there's one in St. Petersburg, then there's another 4 years later which opens in Moscow. The conservatoire has become the center for musical excellence, and Russian music training becomes the global gold standard for music training. And as Mariana said, one of the first students was Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, who was a lawyer but decided to change profession. And he would then go on to become the first professor at the conservatoire. And 20 years later, after that, he would be chosen by Andrew Carnegie to open the grandest new concert hall in the world, the Carnegie Hall in New York, to conduct his own piece as the #1 composer globally, which Tchaikovsky reached at that time. So we'd now like to welcome Caroline to say a few words. Caroline is our guest of honor this evening. Marianne, I'll let you take over.
I just feel when did you get the idea, and how long did it take you sort of to understand that you have passion for Russia, royalty, and Romanovs?
Wow. It's something that I've been working on for many, you've done the same thing, for many years with my colleague. And this is to co-curate the exhibition Russia, Royalty and the Romanovs, which is currently on display at the Queen's Gallery at Buckingham Palace. So I hope you'll all come and see it, if you haven't seen it yet. And this exhibition really explores the relationship between the British royal family and the Russian imperial family. So of course everything we're hearing is in effect the soundtrack to this exhibition, because the exhibition begins with that historic visit, the first ever member of Romanov to leave Russia and come to Europe with Peter the Great, with that magnificent portrait by Godfrey Kneller, which he gave as a gift to William III, the King of England at the time. And like this evening, the exhibition is bookended, of course, with the end of the Romanov dynasty, but we also go a little bit beyond that, into the 20th century, indeed into the 21st century, to show that that relationship, albeit in a different form, of course, still continues today between our two countries. And it's wonderful to be able to celebrate the culture, the shared patronage that the two families had throughout the 18th and 19th century, and of course to look at the link between the two families, the dynastic link, which was made in 1874 with the marriage of the second son of Queen Victoria with the daughter of Emperor Alexander II. So this music is wonderful this evening because it's bringing that story to life, and it's fantastic to hear.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that you probably spent also revisiting the theme and maybe waking up at night thinking what you could change or do a variation on. What was for you the most special discovery in the archive? Thinking, okay, nobody did it before and you found it.
Yes, well, there have been many interesting discoveries along the way, because the collection of Russian works, or works associated with Russia, which illustrate this shared cultural history, are many and very diverse. And so I think one of the biggest surprises was just how big those collections are, and that so many of them have actually not been exhibited before. But in terms of discoveries, I think it's been really reattributions of paintings, and being able to research in the archives in Russia, and to marry up those archives with the royal archives, which are kept at Windsor Castle, and to bring and draw together this new research. So there are many exciting discoveries.
Yes, I think probably the Buckingham Palace isn't big enough.
Well, there are about 400 things in the exhibition, so it's quite big. But it's just a wonderful moment to sort of celebrate our shared cultural history, I think.
That's amazing. It's such a gift what you gave to us, Caroline. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
On violin, Tian Yoma, and on piano, Nigel Hutchinson are going to play a piece by Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, Valse Scherzo in C major, opus 34. Tchaikovsky his connection to the Romanovs wasn't only that he went to the conservatoire that owed so much of its existence to the Romanovs, but that he was also friends with Alexander III, in whose reign we now find ourselves. And as a friend, imperial patronage was all very well, but he wasn't actually getting any money, and Tchaikovsky's fortunes varied very greatly. One minute he would be very rich, find himself quite wealthy, the next minute he would be quite poor and quite down on himself. And he was quite a nervous and quite a shy man. But at one point his sadness got the better of him, and he turned, like all too many artists, to drink, in his case cognac, and he had a little bit too much. And with this Dutch courage, he sat down, a little the worse for wear, and he wrote a letter to Alexander asking for 3,000 rubles a year, I beg your pardon, 3,000 rubles a year stipend on which to survive. He wrote the letter, he sent it, and drunk, obviously, went to bed. Woke up in the middle of the night, suddenly realizing what he had done, that he had sent a demanding letter to the Tsar of all the Russias, and spent the rest of the night in a cold sweat, terrified of the consequences. In the morning, he went to the postmaster, pleaded with the postmaster, who said, "I'm afraid your letter is gone, there's nothing I can do." He then spent a week in further sweats, probably hardly sleeping at all. But at the end of it, a letter came from the Tsar's court minister. Thank you for my own notes. A letter came from the court minister saying, "Here, the Tsar has agreed to your request for 3,000 rubles a year. You will receive them, and the Tsar will be much offended if you will not accept." So it had a happy ending, fortunately. So, staying with Tchaikovsky, we'd like to welcome to the stage Aygul Ahmedshina, who will sing a piece written by Tchaikovsky, which in Russian means, "If only I would have known."
I'm Waiting for You by Rachmaninoff.
Я жду тебя, закат угас, и ночи темные покровы спуститься на землю готовы и спрятать нас. Я жду тебя, душистой мглой ночь напоила мир уснувший, и разлучился день минувший навек с землей. Я жду, терзаясь и любя, считаю каждое мгновение полно весна идет.
Tchaikovsky had a student whom he rated very, very highly, and Tchaikovsky was delighted by the fact that he knew that he was handing over the baton that he had found in another Russian, another great, globally significant player in music, which was to be Sergei Rachmaninoff, who was studying under Tchaikovsky at the Conservatoire. And in Rachmaninoff's final exam, Tchaikovsky awarded his student not only 5 stars, which is the maximum, but he gave him 5 stars with 5 extra pluses, which is not a thing. It's just he added 5 pluses onto the 5 stars, which was a maximum score already. And he wished his student well. I bless you in your musical career. And of course, Rachmaninoff would go on to perform at Carnegie Hall as well, but neither of them would ever have dreamed at that time that when Rachmaninoff came to play at Carnegie Hall, it would be as an American citizen, as an immigrant and an exile who had tragically left his homeland behind. Rachmaninoff in exile never gave a single interview, but in 1931, he was devastated. It's very difficult to overstate just how devastating this loss of country was for Rachmaninoff. Basically, his creative impulses were completely shut off by his emigration. And in 1931, finally, he broke his silence, and he wrote a letter which was published in the New York Times on the day of the Russian New Year. And it was highly, highly critical of the regime. It talked of communist oppressors of Russia. It cited starvation conditions, repression of dissent, concentration camps, executions without trial, cruelties, wholesale murders, and common law crimes. This is a musician, this is a composer, speaking out against the rule, the oppressive rule going on in his homeland. And if you bear in mind that Stalin, remember, sent a killer to kill Trotsky, to find Trotsky in Mexico and kill him with a pickaxe, you realize the risk that Rachmaninoff was essentially taking by being critical of that regime. Rachmaninoff's Deux Morceaux de Salon, Opus 6, The Romance and the Hungarian Dance. Tiago.
Thank
to give you a sense of Rachmaninoff and his feeling for music, I'd just like to read you something that he said, that he wrote in, I think it was his diary. I feel like a ghost, wandering in a world grown alien. I cannot cast out the old way of writing, and I cannot acquire the new. I have made an intense effort to feel the musical manner of today, but it will not come to me. I cannot throw out my musical gods in a moment and bend the knee to new ones. Even with the disaster of living through what has befallen the Russia where I spent my happiest years, yet I always feel that my own music and my reactions to all music remain spiritually the same, unendingly obedient in trying to create beauty. And we feel that nothing better expresses these feelings than his music in the piece Vocalise, which will be performed now by Christiana Ignatieva on cello, accompanied by Mariana on the piano, and it is the pieces Rachmaninoff's from his 14 romances, opus 34, number 14, Vocalise. So clearly we've reached kind of what seems to be the end of the Romanovs with the death of Nicholas in Yekaterinburg in 1918. But the question we want to ask ourselves is, does the Romanov legacy continue in some way? And I think the answer is yes. First of all, with, as Mariana was saying, with Stravinsky, with Rostropovich, who was so obsessed with the Romanovs that he recreated the Romanov Palace in his own home, in his apartment in Paris, which was very, very big. 17 rooms, is that right? 12. Oh, I beg your pardon. 12 rooms in Paris, which he had, in which he recreated the Romanov Palace, and he saw himself very much as part of the imperial tradition. But there are several people who carry the Romanov flame forward into the 20th century, further on into the 20th century. Piazzolla's composition came right at the end of the 20th century, which had seen unprecedented bloodshed, and yet there was the one composer, Stravinsky, who considered himself nevertheless a very lucky man. He was the composer of one of the most radical musical compositions of the entire century, as I'm sure you know, The Rite of Spring. He wrote it at his home at Ustulug in modern-day Ukraine. It's now a museum and a music school, and we are very proud to be supporting their ongoing educational musical program with the entire proceeds of the auction, which will be happening later tonight. So Stravinsky, as a result of the revolution, lost his estates and found himself homeless. Like so many Romanov, so many once very, very rich Russians found themselves destitute in the cities all across Europe, Paris, Berlin, London. And Stravinsky was very lucky that he was given a place to stay by a lady by the name of Coco Chanel, who invited him to stay with her. And this began a lifelong fascination for Chanel with imperial Russian culture, to which she had not properly been introduced previously. Coco hired Russian princesses to work for her, and among them was a real Romanov princess, Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, as well as her brother, Grand Duke Dmitry Romanov, who became her lover. Coco was very proud of her coup, having a real Romanov as her boyfriend, and this imperial Russian connection certainly lifted her brand in the eyes of the West. And our fifth and final proponent is Yves Saint Laurent, who at the height of his glamour and fame in 1973 dedicated his Romanov-inspired collection to the imperial Russia of the Romanovs, and Paris experienced its very own Romanoff Variation. You can see the influence of Russian headgear and styles in these designs by Yves Saint Laurent. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us. I hope you've enjoyed the evening. We are going to conclude with a very special dance, specially commissioned for this evening, choreographed and performed by Anna von der Pallen. The piece is called Phoenix, and it's dedicated to the triumvirate of Chanel, Stravinsky, and Grand Duke Dmitry Romanov, but also in a more general sense to the vitality and the phenomenon of Russian culture as established by the Romanov dynasty, which continues to inspire the world.
Bravo.
So I hope you enjoyed the evening, and the artists just show you how many ways to be alive.
A beautiful piece of Anna Stradman.
Thank you so
Thank you for everyone.
And we will see around the church. So the artists show us how many ways to be alive. So thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you.